Will we remember Nico's November, or is Tennessee just a team that pulls out close, low-scoring wins? We're going to find out soon. Welcome to the Volunteer State. I'm Tennessee beat writer Adam Sparks, along with John Adams of the Knoxville News Sentinel. On this episode, we're going to determine where the ceiling is for Nico Iamaleava and this UT offense, and whether the Vols can reach it in the final month of the regular season. There's certainly no time like the present as the struggling Kentucky Wildcats come to Neyland on Saturday. Plus, we're going to refresh that college football playoff picture for the Vols with the first CFP ranking coming out next week. There's a logjam of teams around UT, so we're going to try to make sense of that for you. But let's start with the UT offense and some prime opportunities to really get this thing going in November. John, in my youth, watching Tennessee games, we'll say this was the 80s and the 90s, I remember Tennessee would always have Novembers that looked something like this. It would be a very winnable SEC game against South Carolina or Ole Miss or Mississippi State or Arkansas, one of those teams. There'd be a mid-major game where Tennessee would play some mid-major team for homecoming, blow them out. And then you'd finish the November with Kentucky, usually a blowout win, and Vanderbilt a blowout win. And I'm not saying that the November that Tennessee is going into now has that potential, because obviously Georgia, maybe the best team in the country, is in there. But if we take the other four games, Kentucky is really struggling right now. Mississippi State can score, but they can't stop anybody. UTEP, Tennessee will score as many as they want to on UTEP. This isn't your dad's Vanderbilt team, but Vanderbilt's still a very winnable game for Tennessee. So John? I'm trying to think if it's crazy for me to look at this and think there's every reason in the world for Nico and this offense to really crank up some big numbers in November and look more like the offense that we thought we were getting most of the season. And I'll start with Kentucky. Kentucky's a team that's lost 3 straight. They've got, on the offensive side, they got problems scoring. They got problems at quarterback. They don't know who their quarterback is. On defense, they have problems stopping the run. Auburn rushed for 326 yards on them. Jarquez Hunter in that game had 278 yards rushing. In a loss to Florida, Jaden Baugh had 5 rushing touchdowns. DJ Lagway lit up the Wildcats for 5 passes of 40 yards or more. So you can kind of see a setup where Tennessee should be able to run the ball a lot, and that should set up a lot of play action pass opportunities for Nico to throw it deep. A lot of the balls that he should have completed against Alabama, but he didn't do that late. So John, my question to you is, should we expect Nico in this offense to really hit some 40-point games in this month, or are we just putting too much stock on what was basically 2 really, really good passes by Nico in that Alabama game?
No, when I look at that schedule, I see plenty of 40-point opportunities. Eliminate Georgia, and what do you have? UTEP's one of the worst teams in the country. Mississippi State, as you pointed out, is horrible defensively, and it's clearly the worst team in the SEC. Then you go with Kentucky, which was playing really good defense to start the season. I think its defense is worn down, and that wouldn't be the first time. Kentucky sometimes suffers from a lack of quality depth. And over the course of the season, it's not playing as well at the end as it was maybe at the beginning. I kind of see that type game unfolding. I don't know that Nico will turn into the superstar we expected. I think he will be better down the stretch. One of the reasons I think he will be better, I think he will be running the ball more. You brought up Kentucky. What it did against Jarquez Hunter, gave up 278 rushing yards. This is with Dylan Sampson, Tennessee is a run-first team. Tennessee can run the ball, and I think it can run the ball on Kentucky. It definitely can run the ball on Mississippi State and UTEP. So that really leaves Georgia as an obstacle. Vanderbilt, is completely different animal because of its ability to control clock, run the ball itself with the option. So I still see Vanderbilt as a potential pitfall, but I think Tennessee's offense is going to look better down the stretch of the SEC season than it did in the middle of the SEC season when it really struggled to move the ball against Oklahoma, Arkansas, and even Florida.
I like the order of this schedule for Tennessee to get the offense going. And when I say the offense going, I mean the running game has been phenomenal. I tweeted out a stat earlier today that took a lot of Tennessee fans by surprise. It was that Tennessee has the number one scoring offense in the SEC, almost 40 points a game. By the way, they have the number 3 scoring defense in the country. But that first number startled a lot of people because they think this offense is struggling. How can it lead the SEC? Of course, when you score like 60 points a game in your first 3, that skews the average a little bit. But the average in SEC games for Tennessee, which they've had 4 so far, if you take the average of their scoring and their opponent's scoring, the average score for Tennessee in SEC games right now is 21.5 to 17. And it's hard to think that they can get to the playoff and finish at least 10-2 playing games like that, because you're going to win most, but you're going to lose some. And of course, they lost Arkansas in that way when you're having to score low and very close. But I like the order of this November for Tennessee to get the offense going, the passing game especially going, because as I mentioned, Kentucky's bad against the run. Tennessee has a lot of confidence in the run. So you can run the ball a lot, dictate terms to Kentucky, and then that will set up those deep passes for Nico off play action. If he can hit 2 or 3 of those, now he has a belief that he can complete those. Then you go against Mississippi State, you've got more confidence in the passing game, and you're in a shootout. Better chance in a shootout in that one than the Kentucky game. And so then you probably get a little more confidence in Nico in the passing game. And then you go to Georgia, and not only does Tennessee then believe more in Nico and his ability in the offense to be balanced, but also you can show Georgia something that you're not a one-dimensional offense. And then you get through that game and, you can hang 60 on UTEP or whatever. But I like the setup of this. I'm buying into the idea that Tennessee is closer than what they showed for about the first 3 quarters of that Alabama game. Because if we look back, pass protection was a problem. It was not a problem in the Alabama game, at least not to the extent you would think it would be. Play calling was much better in the Alabama game. There was some creativity. Those deep balls that we keep talking about that Nico missed, they were open, and they were open because they were well-designed plays. The wide receivers, I liked parts of their game in the Alabama game. So I think a lot of the pieces are there for Nico to take the next step. What's the obstacle if this passing game does not get going in the last month? What could be the impediment?
I guess it would be the same factors that thwarted it earlier in the year. You get a decent pass rush from your opponent. Your tackles can't block edge rushers. Nico feels the pressure, misses some open guys. Receivers don't turn any short passes into long gains, those kind of things. But I like the picture you painted before that. I think the running game can. I'm taking out Georgia. That's just taking it out for discussion purposes because Georgia is one of the better teams in the country. But against the rest of the field, Tennessee can dictate the terms, I think. It can go out and run the ball. And as you said, that takes the pressure off Nico. It takes pressure off those offensive tackles, feel like they got to, take a step back before the ball snap to try and, or maybe hold to take care of one of those edge rushers. So I think the offense will work more smoothly. And I think also the play calling, as you pointed out, has gotten better. And I think it's a better understanding of just what this team can do. That the first part of the season, those first 3 games when Tennessee scored 191 points, that was an illusion in terms of offensive efficiency. That's not who this team is. So you do have some limitations, but work within those limitations. When you can run the ball the way Tennessee can run it, I just really believe it's important that Tennessee runs Nico more, because I think when you can run the ball with Dylan Sampson the way it's running, that opens up some running lanes for the quarterback too, some big plays in the running game. So I expect the offense to function more efficiently down the stretch than it did in the midsection. Not hit the highs that it did against those weak opponents, but not struggle so much as it did in the middle of the schedule.
And I think a nice storyline to watch on the offensive side, especially in the passing game, is what happens at wide receiver. If Tennessee is to make the playoff, then this is going to be a longer season where you're going to have to lean on a lot of different guys. And there is, I don't know if there's depth, but there is balance at wide receiver. Squirrel White has been beat up now for 3 games. He left the Arkansas game with basically a sling on. We think it's AC joint, like shoulder. And then the Florida game, he left that one early and then came back. And then the Alabama game, he stretched out for a ball, left that game and did not come back. It basically every game since the Arkansas game, he has landed on that shoulder, separated it, popped it out of place, sort of gutted his way through that, and returned the next week or later in the game. There was particularly that deep ball against Alabama where, you tend to think maybe he makes that catch if he's not anticipating the pain he's going to have when he lands on that shoulder. So Squirrel White is a question mark there. We'll get the injury report here in the middle of the week, and it'll be updated later in the week. Josh Heupel says Squirrel White, he anticipates him playing. There are other options there, though. We asked Kelsey Pope about this, the Tennessee wide receivers coach, of what he could do there. And, there's some obvious options. Chaz Nimrod is the backup to Squirrel. He can play there. Chris Brazzell, I'm interested to see if they try to use him in the slot. The touchdown catch that he made late in the Alabama game was from the slot. Now, that was a play that I had seen in practice. We weren't allowed to film it, but I saw that in preseason in practice where they would move him to the slot just for that particular route. I'd be curious to see if they could use him in the slot in the rest of the field. Another option is Mike Matthews, the 5-star freshman. That's the one that Tennessee fans all want to see. Just reading between the lines from Kelsey Pope, it sounds like that's not going to happen, at least to the extent that Tennessee fans want it to happen. There's some inconsistencies there. They want his blocking to be a little better. They love his long-term. They're still trying to get him to the point where they think he's an every down receiver in this offense. I think he's a starter next year, as long as they can keep him engaged, and they tend to think he's pretty well engaged right now. But John, at what point do you say, Mike Matthews can't do A, B, and C, but he can do D really, really well. So let's see if he can just go do that. And I ask that I think of back when I used to pay a lot of attention to the Tennessee Titans. They had Randy Moss one year, if you remember that. And Randy Moss barely played in some games, and the coaching staff would say after the game, well, he doesn't know all the plays and he's not a good downfield blocker. So until he can do that, we don't want to use him. He's not an every down receiver. Of course, then he goes to the Patriots and sets a bunch of records. So I asked that to ask the Mike Matthews part. Is it worth getting him in the game just to get him in the game?
I think coaches tend to focus on what a player can't do, regardless of the position, as opposed to what he can do. They look at what can go wrong as opposed to what can go right. So I can see their reservations about Mike Matthews. But what Tennessee needs in the passing game is a big play.
Yep.
that's what it's kind of lacking. We've seen a few of them. We saw one with Chris Brazel that you mentioned. A great play, great catch, good throw. Everything worked. Boy, when you're in a close game, those are kind of the plays that shift the game your way or an opponent's way. So, yeah, I would give him a shot. But you also, I understand this thing about the blocking though, because this is a run first team. And you get Dylan Sampson in the open field, and you sometimes if you talk about big plays, that big play could come from one more block where your wide receiver can take out a DB and just enough to enable Dylan Sampson to go to the end zone. So I can certainly see the thinking on that. But I do think you've got to just keep in mind that if this guy has big play capabilities, and he might, situational type deals where you could use him. I think that would be worth now. It'd be nice if Dante Thornton was comfortable in the slot, but he wasn't last year. He's more of a wideout. Watching Squirrel White, it seems as though he's got one of those injuries that you can't fix. He's just going to play with this. And we're going to see this from 1 week to the next. Yeah, Josh Heupel thinks he can play this week. Yeah, he can play, but he's going to play in pain. And it hurts when you see him go down and hit the turf. Anybody that's ever had a problem with his shoulder can kind of feel that and wince. But I don't think he's going to get better. I just think this is what we'll see in the last few games of the season.
And John, before we move on to the playoff discussion, let me hit you with one more on Nico. What's the latest that Nico could have a big breakout game that would satisfy Tennessee fans going into the offseason? I'm talking about a game that says, okay, he's arrived. This is what we've been waiting for. And we know we're going to get this more in the future. And what I mean by that is like a 300 yards passing or 3 touchdown passes or 200 passing and 80 yards rushing, those sort of games where you say that was a really good performance against an SEC team. I tend to think that has to happen in the next 2 games. I think it has to happen before Georgia because I don't think you can count on him having that type of game in Athens. And then if he has it after Georgia, well, who cares if he does it against UTEP? And if he does it against Vanderbilt, that's fine, but it's also the season finale. So I tend to think for Tennessee fans to be really, really excited about Nico's future. I mean, really excited. He needs to have that type of game against Kentucky or Mississippi State. Do you agree?
I guess I'll look at it differently, Adam. Not so much at the stats. To me, it's more important on how he plays against Georgia. If he plays a mistake-free game against Georgia, hits open receivers when he has the opportunity, makes some timely runs, I think Tennessee fans will look at that in a different light and maybe more favorably, excuse me, than they would if he passes for 300 yards on Mississippi State or has a great statistical game. I think it was because what we've seen is in those first 3 games, he didn't have to do much, but he did really well, and he had a lot of highlights. The overall stats weren't great, but he didn't play long. So I think it's more than stats. I think fans will look at it. Well, you saw how he played against Georgia's defense. If he can avoid turnovers and make some timely plays, running and passing, I think Tennessee fans will feel very confident going into next year. And it would help if he also played well in the other games too. In other words, that you don't just have one game, you kind of have a body of work that suggests, yeah, this guy can get it done. He has arrived. He's not what we might have thought he was in preseason, but he's not what we thought he was in the middle of the season either.
Yeah, I like that that description. More of overall feel as opposed to just numbers. And I guess I'm missing the obvious here because I said let's not necessarily talk about the Georgia game, but if Tennessee were to get to the playoff, the narrative would accelerate quickly if Nico played well in one playoff game. Like, for example, if Nico plays pretty well, but, just sort of, makes steady progress late in the season, and then he has some moment like in the Alabama game where he's really good in the fourth quarter, and he does that to beat Notre Dame and Neyland in the first round of the playoff. Like, anything that he didn't do well up to that point would be completely forgotten. And so that takes us to the next topic. I want to talk about the playoff picture because this sort of gets refreshed each week. John, I think there's some legitimate reasons for Tennessee fans to be a little nervous. When I'm over at the football facility, you don't hear coaches or players or anything talking about the playoff, but you do hear like support staff talk about the playoff. And there's a little nervousness each Sunday when the playoff projections come out, because we've talked all off season and even in the season. If you get to 10-2, you're probably going to be in the SEC. Tennessee could win out except for the Georgia game, get to 10-2. You would think they'd be in, and I still think they have a pretty good chance of that. But it's a pretty crowded field right now. I think more crowded than we thought. USA Today, our parent company, they have a mock projection of the playoff, and I think Tennessee was like an 8 seed or something like that, and they'd be hosting. ESPN had 12 of their experts project this. 6 of them have Tennessee in, 6 of them have Tennessee out. So that's a coin flip. But let me lay out sort of some of the playoff picture. I just want to focus on the SEC and just games this week right now, for things that could help Tennessee and maybe ease the anxiety of Tennessee fans. There's 3 games I'd really circle right now that have playoff implications this weekend in the SEC. Texas A&M is 7-1. They're going to South Carolina. In the open week when Tennessee was off, A&M sort of stole Tennessee's spotlight that they had gotten with by beating Alabama. A&M got that by playing really well in the second half and beat LSU. A&M, if they lose before the end of the season, that Texas game, if they lose one, they would have to beat Texas probably to get in. So they can't afford to have a loss between now and Texas. I think at South Carolina just screams to me trap game, because South Carolina has a good defense. It's not an easy place to play. So A&M at South Carolina, A&M could be vulnerable in that game. Number 2 game in the SEC, Ole Miss is 6-2. They lose another one, they're out. They go to Arkansas. I think that's another place where you could see a mild upset. And the last one, Florida, Georgia, that's an old rivalry. I don't think Florida has much of a chance, but you never know in rivalry games. And Georgia is coming up on a pretty tough stretch where they play Florida, Ole Miss, and then Tennessee. If Georgia looks like the best team in the country, but if they were to lose another game, they would be on the ropes. They'd be close to on their way out. So, John, just in the SEC there, what chance do you give of any of those going Tennessee's way, of A&M losing, Ole Miss losing, Georgia losing this weekend?
I don't give much chance of Florida and Georgia. Kirby Smart played at Georgia. I found that players who become coaches don't forget what happened when they were players. Don't forget how much those rivalry games meant for Georgia, the rivalry against Tennessee. Kirby's never lost to Tennessee. He remembers the Florida rivalry, of course, in the annual game in Jacksonville when he was a player at Georgia. I think Georgia will be ready to play in this game. And it is. You're right. Anything can happen in a rivalry game, but I just think Georgia will have kind of an edge in that game because of Kirby. And I think of him as a great motivator. So I don't see much. If I were Tennessee fans, I wouldn't sit down and watch that game and get all fired up and just, I think that could be wasted emotion.
Sure.
You can tell your wife, Bev, that save your emotion for the other games. I think the other 2 games are very realistic. South Carolina, as you pointed out, is very good at home. It's an underrated hostile venue. Those fans get up for South Carolina. Sometimes even when South Carolina isn't very good. A&M coming off a big win, its biggest win of the year. Here's the thing about A&M, though. It's going to have to lose twice. A 10-2 A&M team against a 10-2 Tennessee team. A&M's schedule is tougher.
Yeah.
And I think it would get the edge over Tennessee. You got to remember that. So it needs to lose to Texas too. And really, you think about with Texas, Tennessee would be better off if Texas, I guess. Well, maybe not. Texas's schedule. Texas doesn't have a great win. Texas ascended to number 1, and we kind of got, wow, this is the team. It's better than all of these other teams we think are pretty good. And then Georgia happens. So now you look at Texas's schedule, and it beat Michigan and Ann Arbor. Normally, that's a big deal. It's not a big deal this season. It needs to beat A&M to have that kind of win, I think. So, but that's a possibility, certainly. I do like A&M, though, to win that game. The other one, the Ole Miss Arkansas. Arkansas is good at home. Ole Miss has a real penchant for shooting itself in the foot. I've never seen a team get more unnecessary personal foul penalties. I mean, sometimes really good aggressive teams get a lot of 15-yard penalties for personal fouls. They're just so aggressive, and they overcome it with sheer talent. Ole Miss is a talented team, but it's not that talented like some of those dynasty teams we saw at Alabama, or the best Georgia teams, are going way back to those Miami teams with pile up personal foul penalties and all kinds of penalties. So that, to me, that's a game where Tennessee fans could really root hard. And that won't come difficult for them. They'll be rooting against Lane Kiffin. That should come easily for most of them. That's a game you get Ole Miss with 3 losses, they're out of the picture. Because if Ole Miss ends up with 2 losses, it's going to have a better strength of schedule than Tennessee.
Yeah,
so it's not a team you want to be tied with.
Yeah, it's funny. You now, if you're a Tennessee fan, you want Georgia to lose. You want A&M to lose. Ole Miss, you want to lose to knock them out, but then you may want Ole Miss to beat Georgia later. So and that's why I lay this out, because Tennessee fans, you're really rooting for one team one week, and you may be rooting for its opponent the other week, because you just want these other teams to pile up losses. So you're not in competition with as many teams. And I think one thing we didn't touch on in the pod last week was the impact that could happen to Tennessee outside of the SEC. UT fans should want the best teams in the Big 12, in the ACC, and the Big 10 to lose. There are projections that have, now catch this, there are projections that have 4 Big 10 teams in the playoff: Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, Indiana. There are projections that have 2 or maybe even 3 ACC teams in the playoff. Miami, Clemson are the obvious ones. Pitt is now in a lot of projections. There are projections that have 2 Big 12 teams in the playoff: BYU and Iowa State. Kansas State's in the conversation. I think they're probably more spoiler than anything now. Notre Dame's probably going to get in. You'll have a group of 5, a mid-major school, get in. If you add up all the teams that I just said from all those other conferences together, you get 10 teams in a 12-team playoff, which means you leave 2 for the SEC. Now, I don't think all those are going to get in, because I don't buy that there's any chance SEC would only get 2 in. I think they get 3. I think they maybe get 4. But you could be in a tough spot if you're Tennessee at the end of the year. Say if you're 10-2 and you're comparing your resumes to a lot of these other teams. So Tennessee fans, you should root for these teams to lose. Now, John, I'm not going to load you up here. I'll go one conference at a time. Ohio State at Penn State this week. Ohio State 6-1. Penn State is undefeated. I think Tennessee fans should root for Ohio State to lose, because Ohio State, despite the fact that we sort of like Texas think of them as an elite team, they don't have a top 25 win. Now they play Indiana in late November, But Penn State has a soft schedule. I could see if Penn State beats Ohio State, they could run the table, get all the way to the Big Ten championship game. I think Penn State's going to get in if they win this game. If Ohio State loses this game, I think it's very good for Tennessee because I think Ohio State could actually end up falling out of the playoff. Shouldn't Tennessee fans root for Ohio State to lose this game?
Definitely, and I don't think most fan bases have any problem rooting against Ohio State. That's what,
right.
particularly an SEC fan base. I think they thrive on seeing Ohio State lose, particularly when it's in the running for a national title. Indiana is a team nobody saw coming. I don't think anybody predicted. I think Indiana is going to make the playoff. And I think
you do, really. You
yes.
think Indiana gets in?
Yeah, I think it's the real deal. I do. I know it doesn't have any good wins at this point. I mean, its schedule has been, but it's been dominant. That Nebraska win really got my attention because Nebraska is a pretty good team. It's not a horrible team, and Indiana blew it out. I kind of thought of Indiana as a lightweight on defense, kind of pass happy, that type team. It's much more than that. It can run the ball. It won last week and beat the spread with its backup quarterback, Tavian Jackson, who used to play at Tennessee. That game got my attention too. Here's what I think Tennessee fans should hope for, and I don't think this is out of the question. Not only does Ohio State lose to Penn State, it loses to Indiana, and it's done. That's 3 losses. It's out of the picture. Then you've got Penn State, Oregon, and Indiana. Tennessee can live with 3 Big Ten teams making the playoff. 4 is a problem, a big problem. So I would want to get Ohio State out of there. I think when I went into looking in preseason, I really thought the SEC could have 5 teams in the playoff. I changed my mind when a couple of conference games went the other way. The A&M game, the LSU to Notre Dame, LSU, Southern Cal. See, Notre Dame's a problem too. I was thinking when I saw the first week of the season, even though Notre Dame beat Texas A&M, a big win at College Station, Southern Cal beat LSU, and I thought, well, Southern Cal could take care of Notre Dame. I don't see that happening now. It might. There've been upsets in that rivalry. But I'm looking at Notre Dame as making the playoff now, even though it lost to Northern Illinois.
Yeah, name recognition alone, I could see Tennessee fans being pretty miffed if Indiana got into the playoff and not, let's say, a 10-2 Tennessee team. But that would be the case for, I think, any SEC team in that situation. I think Tennessee fans need to, when they look at the Big Ten, they need to root for the contenders and the pretenders to be separated as quickly as possible. And I think we thought that would be Ohio State as a contender, Indiana as a pretender. I think Tennessee fans at least should hope they'll swap and get Ohio State off the board. So I think that's where the anxiety is coming because we think there are still as many contenders, but then there are new teams coming in like in Indiana. So Tennessee fans root for Ohio State to lose to Penn State and then try to get them off the board as quickly as possible. In the Big 12, Texas Tech is at Iowa State. Iowa State is undefeated. And Kansas State, 7-1, they're at Houston. As I mentioned before, I think Kansas State's probably going to be more spoiler. But between Iowa State, Kansas State, and then BYU, who's probably the favorite right now to win the Big 12, you've got 3 teams in the mix. And there's certainly a scenario where, Iowa State and BYU, I think they could meet up, in the Big 12 championship. The winner gets the auto bid. The loser would only have 1 loss, and it would be to the champion. And so you could have at least 2 teams in the Big 12 to get in. John, could Iowa – I don't think Iowa State can lose at home to Texas Tech. I don't think Kansas State loses at Houston. Is this just a week where those 2 teams plus BYU, they stay in the mix?
Probably, but Kansas State wasn't very good against Kansas. A rivalry game, granted, but Kansas hasn't been very good this year. So there's a possibility with that. Iowa State and Texas Tech. Texas Tech is one of those teams I've always regarded as it can have one of those games that comes out of nowhere. I've thought about certainly when Mike Leach was the coach there, but just going way back of all the years I've watched college football, Texas Tech was always kind of a wild card team to me. It might knock off Texas, or it might. So I don't think Iowa State's as good as its record. I think that's a game I'm very cognizant about. Is if you're a fan, and I'll tell my wife this, don't waste emotion on that game. That team's not going to win. I would invest some emotion in Texas Tech. I'd be willing to do that.
Okay, so and I highlight these to tell Tennessee fans, specifically SEC fans generally, that you just want to trim off some teams off of these other conferences. Now, the Big Ten, what we mentioned earlier, I think they probably get 3 in. You don't want 4 in, but I think SEC could live with 3, and Tennessee could. We're saying all this assuming Tennessee is a 10-2 team and competitive against Georgia. If Tennessee is 11-1 and beats Georgia, they're not only in the playoff guaranteed, they're probably in the SEC title game. But the last one is the ACC. And John, I see a real opportunity for the ACC to be trimmed from, projections have them getting 2 or 3 teams in. I think that could be a 1-bid league. I think those teams in that conference could essentially cannibalize each other. Miami's probably going to run the table. Miami would get the auto bid, but this weekend, Pitt is at SMU. Pitt is undefeated. SMU is 7-1. And then Louisville is at Clemson. Clemson is the potential playoff team, 6-1. Louisville's a solid team. So, John, I think one of those 2 teams, Pitt or Clemson, I think one of those teams loses this weekend. Are you buying that one of those teams is and by the way, if Clemson loses 2, I think they're probably out. They got blown out by Georgia at the beginning of the year. If Pitt loses 1, they don't have name recognition. I don't think they're a great team. I think if either one of those teams lose, I think you either take them off the board or you get pretty close to that. Do one of those teams lose this weekend?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. The ACC has been much better than I thought it would be. And I think that's a problem for all SEC teams. You mentioned Louisville, I think, has lost 3 games, but it's a pretty good team. It hung in there against Miami, can score a lot of points. Clemson hasn't played, other than Georgia, Clemson has not played a difficult schedule. So that game to me is very much in play for Louisville. I could see Louisville, it's an 11-point underdog, but I could see it winning the game. I think Clemson will win, but I'm not sure on that. SMU and Pitt is an interesting game. Those are SMU. I kind of looked at as a dark horse team in the ACC going into the year. Pitt wasn't even on my radar. Gets an Alabama transfer quarterback who's excelled, and I never gave Pitt much credit for anything. And lo and behold, I don't count it out now. It's playing really well, and I look at some of these games. What I'm wondering when I look at these schedules is Pitt's still got to play Clemson and it's still got to play Louisville. So I think Pitt, that's a game where I would pull for get Pitt out of the way.
Yeah.
Get Pitt out of the way. And I think you maybe root for Miami. One team's going to come out of there. You got to be aware of SMU, though. Its schedule is if it beats Pitt, it's going to finish with 1 loss, and that loss was to BYU, which is undefeated right now. SMU, if it beats Pitt, I don't know, it goes, if it's got just 1 loss, you can't. So maybe let's switch this. I'm looking at Pitt's schedule. This is getting complicated, but I look at Pitt's schedule, and I could see it losing to Clemson and at Louisville.
Okay.
So how about if we have Pitt knock off SMU? I don't think that would be horrible for
Okay.
Tennessee.
You're
Okay.
saying the long plan is Pitt
Uh-huh.
knock off SMU and
Yeah.
then SMU maybe
Yeah.
lose down the road.
Yeah.
And
So
that just highlights how crazy it is that you root for one team. You don't even know how you feel about all these results if you're a Tennessee fan or if you're in one of these SEC teams that's in the mix. I think that's so interesting. I also think that's the best selling point for the entertainment value for a 12-team playoff, which obviously will be a 16-team playoff in not too long. It's just, there's just so many scenarios that could happen. I think this also sort of argues against the idea of a 9-game. If the SEC doesn't get as many as they think they should get in, it's a pretty good argument against the 9-game conference schedule because the SEC is going to argue, hey, yeah, our records aren't as good as the records in those other conferences, but look at everybody we're playing. So I mean, if
well,
there's a 10-2 SEC team that doesn't get in, that's a lot of what you're going to hear, right?
and a lot of it could be comparative shopping. If a 10-2 SEC team loses a playoff bid to an 11-1 SMU team, that would be I don't see that happening, but it's not impossible.
Sure.
If SMU, in other words, if SMU played BYU, I guess in the championship game, and both of those teams, and SMU won, and you had two 11-1 teams in the Big 12, it's possible both could get in. It's not out of the question. But if you look at strength of schedule and you say, well, the SEC is the best team, best league, you'd say, no, we take a 10-2 team over an 11-1 team from the Big 12. But Adam, what I think is really significant, and I thought this in preseason too, were those early games, Georgia-Clemson. Georgia took care of business and beat Clemson. Florida-Miami. Florida got hammered by Miami. And then LSU losing to Southern Cal. And Texas A&M losing to Notre Dame. Not looking at it from a Tennessee perspective, but SEC overall. Those,
Sure.
to me, were very meaningful games because when you look at the SEC and you think if you want to put it up in a pedestal, say there's no doubt it's the number one league. Okay, well then why are you losing? Why are you losing to a Southern Cal team that's lost 4 games? Why can't one of your best teams, maybe your league champion, Texas A&M, win a home game against Notre Dame? I just think that hurts your case a little bit.
Yeah, it opened up a whole lot of more scenarios and conversations. That's for sure. And we will get some clarity next week. Next Tuesday, the first college football playoff rankings come out, and they will obviously change every week. But we'll see an indication on there about what the selection committee, thinks of each of these teams. If Tennessee is like 11th or something like that, then you got to look at it and say, whoa, you got to run the table and beat Georgia. If Tennessee is like 5th, which, by the way, this is a computer poll essentially, but the FPI for ESPN, the Football Power Index, I think Tennessee's like number 5 in the FPI. Of course, Alabama's 3. So there are different people and different metrics that say that Tennessee is a fringe playoff team. There's other opinions and metrics that says Tennessee is a national title contender. I tend to think the selection committee will probably give some weight to Tennessee that its defense is elite, but you're going to have to show something down the stretch on offense to ease before we go, just to ease the anxiety of Tennessee fans. If you go and you ask these other fan bases in media that cover these other teams that we've been calling out here, they're more nervous than you are, because when they look at Tennessee, they say, well, Tennessee's only got one competitive game left. They got Georgia, but there's not really teams on that schedule remaining that's going to beat Tennessee. Now, we both know that's not necessarily the case, but Tennessee has an easy way to go aside from Georgia. A lot of these other teams we've been calling out have 2 or 3 chances to lose games, very legitimate coin flip games. So Tennessee certainly has every opportunity to get to the playoff, but that's a week-to-week process. And this week, Tennessee is against Kentucky. It's a 7:45 Eastern game at Neyland Stadium. We'll be covering it before, during, and after. Check out all of our coverage at KnoxNews.com. And please subscribe to the podcast, share the podcast. And thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.